Good morning. Today is Thursday, May 7th. Welcome to our Gemara Shiur, our Talmud class entitled Treasures of Talmud. This is our fifth out of seven spring sessions. We'll begin with a blessing and then introduce today's subject. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Um, we pick up with a hanging thread from last week's class where we talked about Parshat Balak, the portion where the sorcerer Bilam is summoned by the wicked king Balak of Moab to curse the Israelites. All of this was related to a little folkloric bit about the sorcerer Bilam, who was able to harness the anger of God, which, even though infinitesimal in duration, was so powerful that it could have been weaponized against the Israelites. We know that it actually his design is thwarted, but that's sort of how it came about. That instead of cursing, he blesses. There's a beautiful Rashi that my dad invited me to remind the class or share with the class that I think is meaningful, especially if you've ever lived in a community, as we all do. That Rashi says that the reason that the words came out as blessing were as Bilam looked down upon the encampment of the Israelites, all of their tents on the valley below. He's standing on a mountainside with the king, ready to curse, but he sees the encampment of the Israelites and all of their tents were placed at a diagonal so that no one from the vantage point of his or her tent could peer into his or her neighbor's tent. And so the words of blessing are Matovu ohalecha Yaakov. How beautiful are your tents, O Israel, Mishkanotecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael, your dwelling places, O Israel. That utterance was not only spontaneous, it was informed, and this is Rashi pulling from Midrash, by the fact that what made the tents beautiful is that nobody was playing keep up with the Schwartzes. Nobody was looking into his neighbor's tent and saying, "Oh, I wish my tent were like that person's tent. I wish I had all of the real estate and all of the interior decor that he has in a four-car garage." It was each person content with his or her own lot. So that's what made the tents beautiful. Something to keep in mind if you've ever lived in a Jewish community. So thank you, Rashi, and thanks, Dad, for reminding us that there's a beautiful Rashi to bear on Matovu. Um, so today's subject actually is about what it means to live in community. Um, the 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 title of today's lesson is The Stranger, the Other, and the Limits of Community. So sessions one through four, the first four classes that we have enjoyed together, built up this kind of portrait of how the rabbis framed their ethical and even theological, that is to say, God-oriented vision for our society, especially for the responsibility of the Jew in society, but mostly focused on general precepts that apply across humanity. Um, so the dignity of human life, the sanctity of speech, the limits of truth telling, and the intimate covenantal relationship between God and Israel, between God and the Jewish people. So today we're going to kind of turn the tradition in a more outward direction and ask possibly a harder question, to wit, what does our magnificent ethical tradition demand of us in our relationships with those who are not part of our community? And what holds the community together once we have answered that question? So the texts here are not obscure, but I think this is going to be a challenging lesson. So the way we've been formatting our spring study is to begin with kind of an ex a question that will force us to expand our thoughts around the subject that we will be exploring through text. So the framing question for today is, where does your circle of moral concern actually end? In other words, how expansive is your personal circle of moral interest or moral concern? Not the circle you wish you had, but the one that you truthfully can describe when you think about or look at how you actually spend your time, your money, your attention, your human energies, right? How far does that circle of moral concern extend for you? Um, Not to force an answer here, though I welcome your reflections. So if anyone has a response to that question, this is an invitation to feel moved to share if you do. Audrey.
Well, I think that the moral responsibilities and the ethics that one practices should extend to all humanity, and not just to our Jewish community. I mean, people are people. Well, that's what we've been taught. And you should treat all people absolutely the same in regards to ethics
I'm
and
so glad
moral.
you said that. I think that's a great opening response, and it's probably one that warrants a couple of other responses. So, Michelle, why don't you chime in next, please?
With the emphasis on day-to-day life, um, yes, absolutely, there's ripples and it should go out to all. One should be equal to all. As a practical matter, there are day-to-day life decisions and pragmatic choices one sometimes has to make. When Norm fell in November and broke his hip, everything else stopped. I mean, I dropped everything, almost everything else, except I had a kid who was in the emergency room and had to go to emergency room in another city. So I left him in the hospital. I drove up there. The point is, it becomes all absorbing. And from a practical day-to-day activities, those were the things that called on my responsibility the most. That said, um, I had to ask somebody in our community, my local community, for a ride to the train station to get to my kid. And now somebody else from that community asked for a ride for a medical issue. And so I said, yes, of course I will do that. Um, at year end, I continue to monthly for some things, and at year end, I continue to make contributions to groups that are very intentionally, nonprofits that are very intentionally appropriate, important to me on issues that very much include Israel, although not restricted to that. That. And then, of course, when I think about issues and things that I vote, I have some ability to affect the broader world. I can
Beautiful.
think strongly about, the poor starving children in Name Your Country, but maybe I have less immediate ability to do something about that.
Thank you. I view your comment, Michelle, less as contradiction of Audrey's and more as nuanced expansion and really unpacking. So if we start from the premise that, ideally, our moral concern should extend infinitely to all of God's children, in the applied, in the actuality of, as you said more than once, daily existence, daily life, and also depending on circumstances in one's life, we often do feel compelled to contract the circle. So thank you, Mom and Dad.
Excuse me. Audrey mentioned the word ripple, and what comes to my mind is an image of a still pond and throwing a rock into the middle of it. The big splash zone, that's where most of my empathy, energy, and concern takes place. That's my nuclear family. That's my blood relatives. It ripples outwards to include things like, the ICE attacks in Minnesota and, empathy for oppressed people. And then, it finally, by the time it gets to the shore, it's like, please send $19 a month to save, the elephants in Africa kind of thing, or or these poor dying children, send your donation. So my image is that there's an impact point where most of our energies go, and I think that's usually nuclear family, and it ripples outwards, but I think it gets diminished as it goes outwards, except in very rare circumstances. Universal philanthropy. I guess there are some people who can extend their empathy that far, but that's the image that I have.
Great comment. Thank you. Appreciate it. Judy.
um, Doug's comment does include humanity in the and giving to all and thinking of all.
And
But
elephants, apparently.
for me too, elephants are very much in my kishkas anyway because they're so big and yet so small in their intellect and things. Anyway, the things that that come to mind are individual contact included. One is very strong to me was the connection we got through WRT of our refugee women, Ashta and Mariam, and how they have become so close to us. And part of it is just the being together. The other thing about some of the closeness of people is just to think about others. And I was in a hotel in Washington last weekend, and I needed blankets. And a man came to the door and gave me blankets. And I didn't tip him. And I felt so bad. $2, $3, $4 would have made a difference to this person. And I didn't give it to him. I wanted to call him back. And I just think individual contact and caring is important too. And we have these friends at Greater Centennial, and when we sang with them, Friday night we learned their names. I'm going to mention this on Friday also. By Sunday, when they sang again, we were a community. So it's not on the global issue is one thing, but the individual issue of just thinking the person that's walking next to you, if they need help, you want to help.
Beautiful. Thank you. So proximity to need is also a summons to respond. The probably the best articulation of the idea that you just shared, or probably the most eloquent articulation, is attributed to Emmanuel Levinas, the great French Jewish philosopher, who said that we are obligated by the very gaze of another. Um, I'm trying to get the exact quote up. We actually have it inscribed on the communal tzedakah box outside the coat room in the main atrium of the synagogue. I think we are obligated by the very gaze of another, which is this theology of relationship. It is, I would say, very much adjacent and overlapping with Buber's theology. And as a fun side note, if you'd like to know more about Buber and Buber's spiritual framework for the moral architecture of our lives, rooted in relationship, come this Saturday to either Torah study, where my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Dennis Ross, not the Mideast peace negotiator, but rather the rabbi and husband of Rabbi Debbie Zecher, who served our congregation as assistant associate rabbi for 7 years under Rabbi Jack Stern in the 80s. Rabbi Dennis Ross, who is serving presently as the interim rabbi of congregation Shari Tefillah up in Bedford Corners, will be with us for Saturday morning teaching Torah study on Buber's theology of relationship. And then following, the Men of Reform Judaism of WRT are sponsoring a lunch and learn with Rabbi Ross and me at their annual retreat, but we're not retreating anywhere off-site. We'll be on-site. So that conversation over lunch begins at noon. All are welcome. You don't have to be a man, though it is a men's retreat. It's sponsored by men, not only for men. And Torah study, of course, is open to all. And will be simulcast over Zoom. You can participate remotely. It's really nice if you can participate in person. 9 a.m. for Torah study, for a minyan, 9:45 for learning. noon for the session with Rabbi Ross and me in dialogue. It's going to be really nice. And I think, and touches on what we're learning today. Let's take two more comments and then I'd like to proceed with today's texts because we have a lot. Linda and then Arlene, please. So Linda.
Well, I always thought that, you want to have your life make a difference. And, where you put your energy makes a big difference because you can't put your energy everywhere, even though you try. But today's world is so crazy. It's like, I feel like everything that I have tried to do is like going backwards. And it's very discouraging. It's a very discouraging world. And maybe what we do in our local community is really what's important. And with I think your dad is right, with your nuclear family, that's what makes the most difference.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I know a lot of other people are feeling the same way. So yeah, I think that, we have all been challenged by the fractious political and social climate in which we're living.
Yes.
Thinking a lot about, well, what is the extent of our moral concern? This is not an abstract theoretical issue, particularly for the Jewish community right now. In fact, it's frequently manifesting in my daily life as a debate that needs to be managed as something sacred and not something that's going to burn the Jewish community to the ground, which I think it does threaten to do because there's a kind of raging argument within the Jewish community about whether or not the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel antagonism specifically necessitates that the best Jewish response is to kind of close ranks, batten the hatches, and look out only for our own, and kind of treat the more universal concerns that I also believe are no less embedded in the Jewish tradition as secondary. Look, perhaps the most meaningful metaphorical expression of this idea is one puts on one's own oxygen mask before helping another. But sometimes it manifests as outright anger when a synagogue like ours is invested in resettling non-Jewish refugees from some of the world's most awful, violent conflict zones into our community. Not because they are Jewish, but because we are Jewish. And that's what Jewish people do. And the backlash is often framed as, how dare you look out for the other when you're not doing enough to look out for ourselves? Like, where's your similar support for the communities in southern Israel that have been threatened and violently besieged by Hamas? And my usual response is, why do you think it's an either or? But, again, I think that today's class is going to surface exactly why this is such a difficult thing to provide a simple container for answering. Okay, Arlene, and I also see Karen's hand.
Just one more thing. I just think that the rise of anti-Semitism and the scope of it has entirely caught me by surprise, is all I can say.
Yeah, you and
caught me by surprise.
Right. We've been living inside of an era that I believe has been somewhat abnormal in its lack of overt hostility toward Jews, and all of a sudden the gloves are off. And I would say, again, like in the long arc of history, what we're seeing in the world today is much more a norm than an aberration. And I think it's becoming more and more reasonable to argue that the last 50 years of American Jewish or diaspora Jewish existence, or even Israel's existence, is much more an aberration than the norm. Karen, I know you're not Ed, even though your window says you are Ed.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
So a couple of things. There's the quote, Kol Yisrael Zeh B'Zeh, which, we are responsible for each other. And I think that looks to our Jewish community. But I just want to reiterate that I have certainly believed that it's our responsibility to take care of not just our own community, but anyone else beyond that community who needs some help. And but I agree with the Blake family that we all take care of our nuclear family first, and it ripples out from there. So I guess I feel that part of what we've been brought up in the Jewish faith is that we are responsible for humankind, not just the Jewish humankind. And then looking to Linda's comment, I have to say the rise in anti-Semitism has not been a total surprise to me. Its depth and severity and the broadness of it currently is very disturbing, extremely disturbing. And it is kind of history repeating itself. And in relationship to what we're discussing now, part of what's so dismaying is that Jewish people have always looked to help take care of other people, but it's certainly not reciprocal, as we're seeing now, that others do not feel responsible for our well-being, and that is deeply disturbing.
Yeah, I get that feedback a lot too. It's like, why should we do for others what they are not standing up to do for us? So one of the, more challenging lines of pushback that I've encountered recently in the last couple of years has been, why does WRT invest in an eighth grade student parent trip to the Deep South where we walk alongside and we walk in the footsteps of the great civil rights leaders of yesteryear, of 60 years ago, and more? When especially, it has been pointed out, when October 7th happened, where was Black America for the Jews? And again, I'd like to propose possibly a false binary here. And also, the idea that the civil rights movement in America is divorced from Jewish concern is just historically false. Of the white folk who actually put their feet on the ground in the Deep South to march for civil rights, as many as half of those white folk were Jews. I mean, the scale of Jewish involvement in civil rights is vastly out of proportion to the Jewish population in the United States. And you want to look at like the organizational efforts in advancing civil rights for people of color in this country, in our country. Jews have been at the forefront since long before the organized civil rights movement under Dr. King in the 60s. The NAACP was largely a Jewish black joint effort where most of the philanthropic dollars have been Jewish. Most of the top donors to historically black colleges, Jewish. Like if you look at the cause of the advancement of people of color in this country, Jewish philanthropy, Jewish activism has been not peripheral to, but rather central to those efforts. So that in and of itself is a case for support. But I think the bigger issue is, can we say that our sphere of moral concern must be that expansive, particularly at a moment where Jews do feel, and not just feel, are abandoned by people we had long identified as allies. Like it's a very painful moment for the Jewish people. And so the texts we're going to look at in a moment are not exercises in abstract thinking, but rather exercises in applied Jewish textual morality. Okay, Mom and Dad, one more thought?
As I think Deborah Horn, though, famously put it, people like dead Jews.
Darrah Horn.
Do I have the name right, John?
Darrah Horn.
Darrah Horn, right. And for the first time since the Jewish revolt against the Romans, this is an era in which the Jews actually have military might. And I think as opposed to all those other, centuries where we were, either commerce people or victims, this is an era in which we are a military might. And that's not going over too well with the world.
You're right. Can the world handle Jewish political and military power? That is a question that has been made possible only in the last 78 years. Arlene? All right, I see Arlene's hand up, but I don't see a response there. It even looks like her window's frozen. So if that gets resolved, yeah, it looks like it's stuck. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, Arlene, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to share something that I thought was very interesting and for me very helpful.
Later.
Uh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're getting an interruption. I tried to mute. Okay, go on.
Okay. Right before the pandemic, Lee and I had gotten out of our house in Scarsdale and moved to New Rochelle to Watermark. And I was aware that we had one person who serviced our building on a regular basis. And she and I became friendly. And part of the reason why we did was because I was trying to learn Spanish so that I could eventually communicate with my younger son's family, who's all getting to be bilingual. And in the process, we we became friendly enough that I started to learn something about her family needs. And whenever I could, I helped out. And then she shared with me that somebody who also worked on the grounds, who I did not know as well, his son was having his green card challenged. And for about 2 weeks, this man was so concerned that his son was going to have to leave the country.
Mm.
And I did whatever I could in terms of helping out. And I felt at the end that I gained something, especially when Alejandra, the person who works in our building, wanted me to tell her something about Passover and why it was a holiday that was observed. And so I think that for all of us, there can be simple times that we can communicate with people who are not necessarily of the same background and can do it in a way to make everyone feel more comfortable about learning about other people and what they believe in. And it's worked for me. And then I have one other thing that I want to say also. I have to thank my very good friend Audrey Stoyer for telling us all about the Weizmann Institute in Israel, because Lee and I have now become very active supporters. And we feel, again, very strongly about their kind of reaching out to Israelis, not just Israelis who are Jewish, but Palestinian Israelis as well.
Yeah, there are lots of ways to support Israel that are not only Jewish causes. I mean, even a donation to Magen David Adom, which is the Israeli Red Cross effectively, also manages their national blood bank and their emergency medical services, and even a national storehouse for human milk, for feeding babies. It's an incredible organization, and it, of course, like so many organizations, does not discriminate between Jew and non-Jew. And remember, 1 in every 5 Israeli citizens is not a Jew. All right, we're going to move forward. We've laid some very deep groundwork, and I guess the only other thing I would say before we encounter the text today, which are, complicated and, as is the way of Talmud, at times internally contradictory, is that the rabbis, the classical rabbis, lived in these same nested circles that we've been talking about. The rabbis themselves, the Jewish community, was a small minority community living under Roman Empire, navigating real relationship with real non-Jews, their non-Jewish neighbors, who held who held all the political power while the Jews held little to none. So the texts we're reading today are the rabbis kind of, you can imagine their working notes on how to navigate life in that society. So sometimes they are going to go out there with a statement that strikes you as morally courageous in its willingness to embrace the other, that is to say, the non-Jew. And at other times, we might want to impute a kind of intense particularism to their thinking but ask ourselves the really important question, well, why? Why do the rabbis sometimes feel the need to have a much more inward focus, a kind of protectivist impulse? And I would say, by the way, such a thing is very normal for a minority community deprived of political power and military power to develop. So let's read the text honestly and openly as we do. And I'm going to begin with Tractate Gittin, which comes from the Aramaic word for a writ of divorce, a get. So Gittin means gets. Page 61, Daf 61a. paragraph 5, which is a section that leads us into a Mishnah, right? So core teaching, old rabbinic teaching, and then the Gemara will expand on it as it does. So this is Gittin 61a, middle of the page. All right. In Mimachin biyad aniyei goyim beleket beshichecha uvefea. Okay, what's the concept here? The Mishnah is teaching one does not protest against poor Gentiles. So, ein mamachin, this is the Hebrew word for to protest. Biyad aniyeh, against the yad, it literally means the hand, but it actually means the authority or the power of aniyeh goyim, literally the poor of the nations. This is a euphemistic way of saying non-Jews, Gentiles. Beleket, when they glean, Bishichecha uvefea. Shichecha is a specific word that means the forgotten sheaf. It's actually in the parsha for this week. So we're reading Torah, and it talks about the obligation to leave fallen produce behind in the field so that the poor can take, right? You're probably familiar with this precept. It's a core Jewish precept that the Torah itself repeats more than once. And feah means the produce left in the corners. So the corners of your field are to be left unharvested, and anything that falls to the ground is a forgotten sheaf, and it's not to be picked up. You're supposed to glean from the inner rows of grain, not the corners, and not the stuff that falls to the ground. And it says, we do not protest. I would use the word discriminate against, right? We don't discriminate against Gentile people who come into our fields to take what is sufficient for them to feed themselves and their families. All right. Now, of course, the fact that the Mishnah needs to stipulate this suggests that it's legislating against something real, right? So perhaps the Mishnah is aware of communities where they set up a double standard where no. This fallen produce or the corners of the field are for Jews only. Gentiles not welcome, right? This is a Jewish field. Our Jewish poor need to be helped exclusively. And the Mishnah is legislating in the opposite direction, saying, no, we don't distinguish between Jew and Gentile when it comes to this core precept of feeding the hungry. Okay, everyone with me on that so far? That's a very important line. And then it goes on from there. Mipnei darchei shalom. This is the reason. Mipnei is just a Hebrew word that means because. Darchei shalom, you can probably follow these words even if you don't know a lot of Hebrew. Darchei from derech means a way or a path or a road. Shalom, you know, is shalom. So because of the ways of peace, or you can say, they say here, on account of the ways of peace. Tanur Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, and this is a parallel teaching to Mishnah, this is what we call a baraita, Mishnaic era, but not the Mishnah itself, but it still gets encoded in the Gemara. Mifarnasin aniyei goyim im aniyei Yisrael. We furnish for, mifarnes means to furnish in terms of like providing the physical needs for the poor of the Gentiles alongside, very important preposition, im, right? It doesn't say instead of. It also doesn't say, I think that it's really important just to say, just let it be what it is, which is with. We furnish for the needs of the poor Gentiles with the needs of the Jew. Aniyei Yisrael, the poor Jews. And it goes on and expands the concept outward a little bit, or at least it elaborates. Umivakrin chole goyim, and we visit the sick Gentiles im chole Yisrael, along with sick Jews. V'kovrin meitei goyim, and we bury dead Gentiles with the dead of our own people. Mipnei darchei shalom. Why? The reason that is given is because of the ways of peace. So unpack with me for a moment how you reflect on both the what and the why. Right? It's a fairly straightforward, it's not a hard passage to translate. But what's the core concept here, both in terms of what is being legislated and why it is being legislated. Okay. And don't go according to your own interpretation. Tell me what you think the text is teaching, Dad.
This phrase, John, if you could put the text back up about derech shalom.
Yep. Darchei shalom in the plural, derech shalom in the singular,
Yeah.
same thing. The way of peace, the ways of peace.
I can recall that we have come across that particular phrase before, and the thing that gets me right away is derech shalom. I mean, as far as derech eretz, that's kind of a core concept, and I think this is kind of echoing that idea. We do it because it's the way.
I think there's something to that it is, derech is a pretty strong word in Jewish legislation. It's suggesting that there is a way, a path. Um, and I'm going to say, and I think there's more to this. So Audrey?
Well, I wanted to say, first of all, isn't there a prayer that says that when you're taking the Torah from the ark, that all its paths are peace?
It is.
Okay, that was
V'chol
one.
derachecha shalom.
Right.
Good. Yep. That's another place where we get Darchei Shalom. In Psalms, by the way, or no, Proverbs. It's a verse from the Bible. It's a verse from Tanakh, I believe Proverbs, that is then mapped into, the rabbis pull it from Tanakh, put it into the liturgy for the Torah service, so that when you're putting the Torah away in the ark, it's not when you take it out,
Oh,
it's when you
right,
put it
right,
away, you affirm it is a tree of life to those who hold it fast,
right,
and all
right.
of
That
its
path.
pleasantness and all of its paths are peace. So yeah, you're picking up on a biblical resonance of that phrase. Beautiful, Audrey. And it
And
also
the
makes it clear, I think, apropos, consonant with my dad's comment, this is Torah. What we're
right.
teaching here is this is core. This is not just like fanciful, freewheeling interpretation. Good.
And my
George.
original
Oh,
response was Shalom Habayit.
we talked a lot
That
about the,
that's inward in a sense, but the sense of maintaining peace is primary. I know
yep.
within a family or whatever, sometimes you keep your mouth shut just to
Hmm.
maintain the peace, and
Yeah, right. So there's
or
a
you extend yourself for the same reason.
well said, right? So there's a real, in addition to this being Torah, there's an underlying pragmatic benefit to this. This is realpolitik, right? This is like how do we maintain good relations with the majority population? And the population that, as I said in my little preamble remark before we learn the text, has power, right? So one way to do that is we treat them the same. We bury alongside. We let the poor glean alongside. We visit the sick alongside. Not in addition to, but alongside, implying a kind of a parity of moral concern here. George, please, and then Karen and Ed.
Yeah, how does this justify places like Sharon Gardens, just for Jews, and
Yeah,
then Kensico across the road?
yeah.
So, how does it justify us having
Cemetery.
cemeteries just for Jews?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you could probably argue this in like many things you could argue Jewishly in two different directions at the same time. So I don't think it justifies, I think it merely stands as a Jewish precept. One read on having an all Jewish cemetery, and most traditional Jewish burial takes place in an all Jewish cemetery. Now, Sharon Gardens is actually a local cemetery that is part of a larger cemetery called Kensico. Kensico is a non-Jewish cemetery with a Jewish cemetery adjacent to it. So on the one hand, it flies in the face because it has an exclusively Jewish burial ground. On the other hand, it reinforces the precept because you literally, when you bury your loved one at Sharon Gardens, you are literally burying him or her alongside the Gentiles. Like they are across the road from one another. So, in my view, it actually does substantiate or at least fulfill the precept of the literal meaning of alongside. What I don't know is the pricing different, and that's a different. Fortunately, that's Michael Rosenthal's field. He's our like beloved in-house funeral director. But yeah, George, I'm going to let the question just stand as the kind of provocative question that is itself prompted both by the text and by lived Jewish practice. And I told you that today is going to be an exercise in lived paradox. Or if I didn't say so, today's going to be an exercise in lived paradox. Now I've said it. Karen and Ed, please.
When I was looking at and listening to the reading, I was in my own mind interpreting peace as a really important ideal and value. But there is a question in my mind, and Audrey put her finger on it, because you could interpret peace in the pragmatic way we were discussing. But again, I could be wrong. I tend to view peace here as telling us this is really important. Going back to what you were saying, Rabbi Blake, it's a universal principle of Judaism that we care about others. That's part of our core being. It's not, oh, we care about others because then we'll have more peaceful and smooth relationships in the world. So this is a very illuminating and enlightening passage, to my mind, in thinking about the core values of Judaism.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. You've really set me up beautifully. Um, the entire passage before this, so the previous 2 pages of Talmud are actually very expansive on the subject of this phrase Darchei Shalom. And what emerges from a close reading of Gittin 59b all the way through the passage we just read is that Darchei Shalom can actually be read along exactly the 2 vectors that Ed has identified. Yes, we started with there is a pragmatic benefit to doing to in a kind of egalitarian approach to how we treat Jews and how we treat Gentiles in certain core mitzvah matters. And let's not forget, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, and burying the dead are considered by the Talmud itself elsewhere to be mitzvot she'en lahem shiur, commandments, not optional, like they are obligatory behaviors, she'en lahem shiur, that have no measure. These are not things to be practiced in moderation, but rather to the hilt, to the absolute extent, the maximum extent that one can expend energy. The mitzvot, and there are others, escorting the bride to the chuppah and comforting the bereaved, which is part of burying the dead, and the study of Torah itself. These are all things that the Talmud itself identifies as she'en lahem shiur. They have no measure, right? You can never do enough of these things. So they are the highest category of mitzvot, and therefore they are ethical behaviors where you can go beyond the literal meaning or beyond one sense of the read of mipnei darchei shalom, that these are the ways of peace. It's beyond the pragmatic benefit of maintaining harmonious relations between the Jews and the Gentiles. There's a deeper, I would call it almost fundamentally cosmological principle at play here, and it's articulated in the middle of Gittin 59a, so 2 pages, or 59b, 2 pages back. And all of these things, by the way, if you scroll up, these are all different things that are grounded in the idea of Darchei Shalom. And it goes on to say, Rav Yosef said to Abaye, indeed it is by Torah law, but the reason that the priest reads first is on account of the ways of peace. And they go on to say the quote that, and now I think it was Audrey who said it, aren't the halachot of the entire Torah also given on account of the ways of peace? So there's an argument here saying, is it just these specific things, or is it the entire Jewish tradition? Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all of her paths are peace. Not peace in the narrower sense of maintaining good relations between Jews and Gentiles, but peace in the capital P, big shalom, right? Shalom as an undergirding spiritual norm or spiritual aspiration for Jewish life. So I think you got it beautifully. Maimonides himself likens this in his Mishnah Torah, his code of Jewish law, he cites Psalm 145, which is better known to people who daven regularly as the Ashrei. Ashrei yoshvei beitecha, od yalelucha. Okay, it's a long psalm. It's an alphabetical acrostic where each verse is a different letter of the alphabet. Nun is missing. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but every letter except Nun in the alphabet is given as the start letter for each of the consecutive verses. And one of the verses is Tov Adonai Lakol, which means God is good to all. V'rachamav al kol ma'asav, and God's mercy extends to all of God's works. And Maimonides plays on this word all by reinforcing this notion that God's goodness, and by extension, our moral obligation, is not confined just to the Jewish people. Yes, we may have a special relationship with God, as we've discussed in previous sessions in this semester. But when it comes to like the big picture of what God's design for the cosmos is, there's no discrimination between Jew and Gentile here. God's goodness extends to all. And therefore, caring for the Gentile poor, or visiting the Gentile sick, or burying the Gentile dead, this is not just a strategic compromise for the Jewish people to maintain, relations with a powerful majority where we have always been a disempowered minority. It is actually, Darchei Shalom in this case is much more than that. It is acting in the image of God. Like we are emulating God by not discriminating in terms of our moral concern. All right, remember though, this is only one of 3 texts that I need to get to today. So I really want to move forward because I'd rather make the situation much more complicated. All right, Jonathan, I'm going to take your brief comment first.
Okay, just on the point of peace, I think I just saw a play called Cable Street, and there was a conflict between the father who said, "Don't make a fuss. We believe in peace. Don't annoy the." So that's when we stood up when the Jews when there was a decision about whether to stand up against the fascists who wanted to march into a Jewish area. So I'm saying that, yeah, we want to keep peace, but sometimes I think we take it too far. That we don't want to stand up for ourselves. And then you had the son who said, "I'm going to go out there and help with blockading." I just want to make that comment.
Thank you.
And I think that was my major one. As far as where to be buried, I have no problem being buried in a separate Jewish cemetery.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, we're going to switch to another sugya, another passage of Talmud. This one now from Bava Kamma, which we've seen before. This is tort law, from the section of Talmud called Nizikin, which means damages. So this is 3 large tractates of Talmud: the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. Bava Kamma, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, all about torts. And the passage begins with an extensive exploration of the case, and this is one of those things that rabbinical students will cut their teeth on in their Talmud classes in seminary, is the infamous case of the goring ox, right? If a person owns an ox that gores either a person or property and causes damage, whose responsibility is it? How is the responsibility of the damage assessed? How are the penalties assessed? And so on and so forth. So with that in mind, I will unpack this with you slowly so you understand. And I don't want to do 20 sugyot of complicated Hebrew about goring oxen. It's very, very tangled Talmudic logic and not worth the time. But what's going to be observed in this passage, the rabbis are going to latch on to a disparity between how we treat Jews and how we treat Gentiles that directly flies in the face of everything we just read. Now, how, you ask, can this be? And the answer is, that's Talmud for you, right? Like the book is internally contradictory. You may not feel that does not make it easier to read. It will leave you this class going, well, I don't know what Blake wants us to do with our lives, but that's because it's not my job to tell you. It's my job to help us learn how to think more Jewishly. And thinking Jewishly requires a fairly high threshold for internal dissonance. You can handle it. Okay, so even Orthodox Jews don't think uh, in simple, simplistic binary terms. You know, the Orthodox way is rather sophisticated in its capacity for internal contradiction. This is one such signature example from the Babylonian Talmud. So, Tanur Rabbanan. So there's our keywords again, that this is Mishnaic era. It's a Baraita. And you can see Steinsaltz, I'm sorry, every time I highlight the text, it jumps the margins. So you just have to follow my floating little hand here. The sages taught the following story in the context of the aforementioned halakha, the halakha being about the unequal treatment of Gentiles who own an ox who gores and Jews who own an ox who gores. All right, there's a disparity in the way accountability and penalty is assessed depending on whether the ox is owned by a Jew or a Gentile. That's what this is about. So I'll read in the English because I think it's a little hard to follow in the Hebrew. The Roman kingdom once sent two military officials, and it even tells us there's a loan word from either Greek or Latin, sardeiotot. Those are military officials of the Roman Empire. They were sent as emissaries to the rabbis, to the sages of Israel, and ordered them in the name of the king of Rome, teach us your Torah. All right, so that, again, you can probably already surmise we're in the realm of Agadah, of folklore, of tradition, and not necessarily historical fact. And even though we're going to be addressing a halachic matter, this is very much the way of Talmud. It's going to use anecdotal, agadic storytelling to elucidate a halachic precept. Okay. So these non-Jewish these non-Jewish military officials appear before the rabbis and say, tell us this Torah. We see you're really into this big book. The officials read the Torah and repeated it again, reading it for the third time. So in other words, the point is that they didn't just do a cursory read, they did a deep perusal of the Torah. At the time of their departure, they said to the sages, we have examined your entire Torah, and it is true. I love this, by the way. Again, folklore. But the idea is that even the Gentiles agree, like, yeah, you guys really got something special here. This is right. This is definitely divine wisdom. It's true. Except for this one matter. There's one problem with the Torah, and that is with regard to an ox of a Jew that gored the ox of a Gentile. And the halakha is that the owner is exempt from liability, whereas when the situation's reversed and the ox that belongs to a Gentile gores the ox of a Jew, whether it was innocuous, meaning the ox is not identified as being in the habit of goring other oxen, or forewarned. In other words, the owner of the ox, there are differences in the penalty scale and the accountability measure for whether or not the ox has proved itself already, demonstrated itself to be a goring ox, and whether or not the owner of the ox has been warned, hey, your ox is a problem. You need to deal with this or get rid of it, right? And that's the same. So imagine instead of an ox that gores, imagine a dog that bites, right? We have legislation around this. Like there's a difference between a dog that's never bitten anyone before and a dog that has bitten someone before, and a dog that's bitten someone before, and the owner has been warned, you got to deal with this problem, right? So there's a subtlety of recognizing that one is not equal to the other. But in this case, the Roman authorities are saying, guys, you've got something just patently discriminatory on display here. Whether it was innocuous or forewarned, the owner pays the full cost of the damage, and it seems that the only reason for the difference is that the owner is Gentile in the second case, whereas the owner is Jewish in the first case. In other words, the ox could be the same ox. The habit of the ox to gore could be the same habit. The owner could have been warned ahead of time, same for Jew or Gentile, and yet there's a disproportionate penalty that is imposed upon the Gentile owner, whereas the Jewish owner is dealt with leniency. Do you at least understand the contours of the case here? It's not that complicated, but it's one of those things where reading in the Hebrew is not going to make us feel better about our Jewish learning today. Okay, so I want to come back to now, what do we do with this? Um, the uh, the the Romans are pointing out to the rabbis, we love this Torah, but it seems to smack of Jewish chauvinism, right? It seems to have a problem with us Gentiles. And by the way, there's probably a built-in recognition here. This is very meta, because the rabbis are aware that these sorts of practices within Judaism, these disproportionate or unequal treatment of the Gentile and the Jew, were exactly the kinds of things that the Roman censors at the time were looking for and using as a pretext for discrimination and unequal treatment of Jews who were taxed at higher rates, who were largely subject to being enslaved, who were often, you know, perceived from their history as being rebellious and disloyal to the empire. And so the Romans already have plenty of reasons to not to trust the Jews. And I think the rabbis are actually very circumspect about their own literature, going, are we giving our imperial masters more reason to hate us? Like, and when you see a law in our own Torah that says Gentiles not equal to Jews, and in a way that favors the Jews, whatever it may look like to us on the inside, we might say, well, yeah, put your own oxygen mask on first. Like, we're not going to tax Jews at the same rate. And we're not going to penalize Jewish owners of goring oxen the same way we would Gentile owners. But from the Roman perspective, and I think it's so, let's just assume this never actually happened, right? In which case, it's psychologically incredibly astute and insightful for the rabbis to put themselves in the mouths of how this looked to a Roman military inspector, right? So the rabbis are actually thinking about how do these disparities not just serve the Jewish community, but how might they harm us because of how they look to the imperial power? It's very sophisticated stuff now, and it's like I said, we're muddying the waters. Jonathan, please. Unmute, kindly.
He hasn't.
I'll wait another moment. Jonathan, we wait on you to unmute so we
Okay,
can...
sorry, I had trouble unmuting.
Yep, no
So
problem.
why is this the only example of discrimination? Isn't slavery another very good example where the Gentile is treated differently from the Israelite, where after a certain period of time, the Israelite can be freed, but the Gentile can be kept slave forever? Why
Yeah,
wasn't that an exception for them?
I have no idea. I literally have no idea. Like, in other words, if you wanted to play the role of devil's advocate in your literature and point out any number of painful or provocative disparities between how we treat Gentiles and how we treat Jews, the goring ox falls into a certain category of obscurity that certainly is overshadowed by more glaring, at least to us modern readers, disparities such as the difference in how you would treat a Jewish slave and how you would treat a Gentile slave. You're absolutely right that protections for the Jewish slave and the Jewish slave owner are abundant, whereas protections for the Gentile slave by a Jewish owner are fairly sparse, and thin. So 100% agree, except to say maybe the rabbis are having some fun with this text too, and they want to use something that's a little bit less of a emotionally burning issue. But I really don't know. I mean, you're right. This is one of many places where one could look at our Torah practice, our Torah literature, and say, oh, there's a very strong argument against uh, or an argument that flies in the face of we treat Gentiles alongside Jews equally. The other thing I would say is perhaps the Gentile slave would be a way of bringing up painful history that the Jews did not themselves want to be reminded of, particularly in a context of no political sovereignty or minimal political power and no military. And probably Jews are not allowed to have Gentile slaves at the time the rabbis are writing. whereas Jews may have been allowed to have oxen. So in other words, there may be a lived reason why the goring ox is a better example than Gentile slaves. But yeah, I love your question. It's great thinking. Ed, please.
So, comment and the question, somewhat unrelated. When you point out, Rabbi, that the Talmud is full of contradictions, it reminds me of an old joke, which I now finally understand. It's the two petitioners who appear before a rabbi. The first one makes an argument, the rabbi listens and says, yes, you're right. The second one then makes the contrary argument, and the rabbi listens and says, you're right. An observer says, wait, Rabbi, they both can't be right. And the rabbi says, you're right too. So now I understand. They're all reading the Talmud.
That's right. That's
More,
right.
more seriously, I think you mentioned earlier a question, and I'm just wondering how we put it all together, which is the question of choosing or balancing or priorities, in the sense that feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, there's no moderation, no limit to what we can do. Take it with Gentiles, Jews, we should be helping everybody, and that is part of our core value. On the other hand, we human beings have limited time. How are we supposed to be guided by the Talmud and live our lives?
Yeah, right. I mean, this is one of those areas where I think those who seek a formula for the very specific ways to live Jewishly may not actually be living maximally Jewishly. I never wish to demean my dear colleagues, friends, and fellow Jewish family members who are Orthodox or even the Haredi. I think that in Reform communities, the Haredi are rightly criticized for their discriminatory and Jewishly chauvinistic outlook. And of course, when it's married to extremist behaviors that enact violence against non-Jews, I'm particularly aggrieved and we have to speak up. Having said that, most of the time, the Haredi or the Orthodox often become a punching bag in Reform Jewish circles, and I kind of don't wish for us to participate in that dynamic. I think it's both unhealthy and unseemly. Given the fact that we're a small mishpacha across the world, I think that there's way too much Jewish infighting and not too much Jewish looking out for one another. But one thing that I think the Haredi get wrong is that if you just follow a kind of like simplistic guidebook of this is, and by the way, the more extreme you go into orthodoxy, the less universalistic the outlook, the more particularistic the outlook, right? So there's a lot of welfare that is extended to Jews that would never be extended to Gentiles. So, on the one hand, there's an incredible Jewish social safety net in many Orthodox communities, but don't talk to any Orthodox communities about supporting the efforts to end the genocide in Darfur. That is not language that resonates. And so, for us Reform Jews, the question looms as a question, and it's much harder. There is no definitive answer. Literally, there is no definitive answer. And it may actually rise and fall based on the circumstances. When October 7th, yeah, that's not throwing a stone into the pond. That's throwing a boulder into a puddle, right? And so at a time like that, it may in fact obliterate our ability to care outside of our own circle. And I'm not thinking that's wrong. Um, yeah, right. Okay, I'm going to move on after Audrey's comment.
Just wanted to say that when you say that sometimes the Haredi or the ultra Orthodox are the punching bag, Reformed Jews, it certainly, to my mind, is a reaction to the reverse.
Yeah, and it's worse. Yeah, and sure, it's
We're
worse
not
because
even Jews, let me
right,
tell
we're
you.
not even Jews, and by the way, if we were, we caused the Holocaust, right? So there's like our
Yeah,
lack of fidelity to
exactly.
God's law brought upon the murder of 6 million of us. Okay, yeah, right. It's beyond obnoxious. It's morally atrocious.
Yeah.
Having said that, we Jews right now may have external enemies that deserve more of our fire than our fellow Jews. But even with that, like what I can't do is divorce my mishpacha. Can't do it. Like I may not like them, but I think we all have relatives we don't like, but we haven't figured out a way to divorce them. Okay, we're gonna
Thanksgiving dinner.
the Thanksgiving table, the Pesach table of the Jewish people. It's a big table, and there's always a relative or two there that you would rather not be there, but they're there because they're your mishpacha. Okay, I'm going to move on. In the same sugya, though I inverted the order for clarity of teaching here and the way I wanted my kind of like argument, if you can call it that, to flow this morning. So three small paragraphs previous to what we just read is a longer debate about the what is incumbent on Bnei Noach, the children of Noah, which is a poetic way of talking about Gentiles, right? So Jews are specifically Bnei Yisrael, the children of Jacob, right? That's the Jewish line through the patriarchs and matriarchs. It runs from Abraham and Sarah, but remember, they give rise to Ishmael, who are the Muslims, but also Yitzchak, Isaac, and Isaac's progeny, Jacob. And from Jacob on, Jacob who becomes Israel, they are the Israelites. But way before Abraham, you have this kind of like uber, this Ur father of Noah, who is more of like a father to humanity. And so the rabbis are kind of like debating around the question of, well, if Gentiles fulfill mitzvot, do they get a reward for it? It's not incumbent on them, but if they do it, are they similarly meritorious in the eyes of God? That's the debate here. And let's see what they say. Um, what's interesting is really this part of the argument. Isn't it taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Meir says, from where is it derived that even a Gentile who engages in Torah is considered like a high priest? This is wild, by the way. Just kind of like let it soak in. So they're naming a precept that seems to be known to the Mishnaic era rabbis, and it's stated as if it is a known precept, and now they want to give you a proof text for it. The verse states with regard to the mitzvot, which if a person does, in other words, if a person abides by the mitzvot, if a person performs, does mitzvot. I tell bar mitzvah kids all the time, whatever else you ever learn about Judaism, we're not a belief system. But I go farther with adults and say we're not a religion, but that confuses 13-year-olds. But I tell every 13-year-old when they meet in my office a few weeks before bar bat mitzvah, what makes you a Jew? It's not really what you believe, it's how you live, right? And that's what I say to introduce the wearing of talit, because it's a very physical embodiment of being embraced in something that symbolizes mitzvot. So when you wear this special garment, you're taking on the responsibility for Jewish living, not for a belief. Like, I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I am, however, going to, you're going to hold yourself accountable for living a Jewish life. That's what it means to become bar mitzvah, right? So the rabbis, fully aware that Judaism is not a belief system, that it's a lived practice, it's a tradition of mitzvot, are now talking about, well, on whom are these mitzvot incumbent? And it goes so far as to say that even a Gentile who studies Torah is likened to the Kohen Gadol, Aaron himself, the highest of the high in the religious hierarchy of ancient Judaism. Of the ancient Israelite community, there was no religious authority higher than the high priest, not even Moses, who defers to the high priest in matters of religious practice. And it goes on to use a text from Leviticus chapter 18, which is the holiness code, that says, and we have these mitzvot from God, and it says, let me show you the actual text. Really important to read it closely because it says, which if a person does these mitzvot, he shall live by them. And I want to show you what they're zooming in on one word. It says, Asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem. Loosely translated, when a person does them, meaning the tzvot, v'chai bahem, one lives by them. And this has been endlessly interpreted by the rabbis in the Midrash and the Mishnah and the Talmud, that the point of the mitzvot is that you live by them, not die by them. That, by the way, is why you must break the Sabbath to save a life. It's the same verse that's quoted here. But the emphasis in that instance is v'chai bahem. You should live by the mitzvot, not die by them. Like, don't follow the mitzvot to your own, extinguish your life, but don't be a martyr. Follow the mitzvot, but to the extent that it is a life-giving thing to follow the mitzvot. The thing that the rabbis are zooming in on here is not the latter clause, v'chai bahem, but rather ha'adam, this one word here. It does not say that a Jew or the priest lives by the mitzvot. It says ha'adam, a person, a human. Right? So what the rabbis are providing here is, again, a fairly expansive inclusion of who performs mitzvot, not just Jews. It is actually, the mitzvot are for all people. And then it goes on to say Kohanim, Uleviim, V'Yisraelim, meaning priests, Levites, and ordinary Jews, lo ne'emar. It doesn't say that those are the people who are obligated to the mitzvot, the Kohanim, the Kohen, the Levite, and the Israelite. No, Ela Adam, rather a person. Ha lamadata, from this we learn, she'afilu goy ve'osek b'Torah, that even a goy, even a Gentile who engages in Torah, and that's la'asok b'divrei Torah, that's the word osek, same word, la'asok. Even a goy who immerses himself in Torah, harehu kekohen gadol, that person is like the high priest himself. So now where are we in this? Because we have one more tradition that we're going to read. What I would submit thus far is that on the one hand, we have this discriminatory teaching that says Goyim, Gentiles, are held to a different standard. And the Romans can tell, and the rabbis don't like change the law. They're just kind of left holding this, like, yeah, we have some issues with unequal treatment under the law. But we also have these kind of majestic precepts that suggest a much deeper embrace of the universalistic obligation, that really our obligation is to humanity, irrespective of whether one is a Jew or a Gentile. Jonathan, please.
Okay, so what you said there about non-Jews immersing themselves in Torah. Well, what does that mean? I mean, I don't know non-Jews immersing themselves in Torah, but I do know about the Noahide laws. I mentioned in the chat that if these are the minimum requirements of non-Jews, that if they follow them, they do have a share in the world to come, unless I have that mistaken.
That's right.
So I think that's a very important point.
It's part of the same thread of wisdom, I would say. And by the way, I have some experience, particularly because I've served communities outside of a Jewish metropolis like Scarsdale, with many more non-Jewish participants in the life of synagogue, including people who are Jew curious, including people who may someday convert to Judaism. But when I've served communities in Rhode Island, in West Virginia, in Dayton, in Bloomington, Indiana, in Kentucky, most of which were in younger years of my training and development. But I'm always moved. Most of those Torah studies on a Shabbat morning have at least a few Gentiles who drop in or who are regulars. And I've had many, and they've never chosen to convert, but I've known many travelers who've said, I'm going to study Torah, and this text is meaningful for me. It's like, wow, a non-Jew who wants to learn our ways, that's not something over which to be dismissive, I think is the best I can say. It's rare. It's certainly not the norm. But it is, for me, it is not something to be afraid of. It's actually something to be proud about. Like when I have people who are not Jewish, who are Jew curious, I think the embrace should be very wide. I don't believe in turning away people who are sincere in their desire to come closer to the Jewish tradition, whatever their background may be. That's my view.
Well, I agree with that. Can I just say that in the New Testament, I think includes the Torah, doesn't it? Does
Well, yeah, I mean, it's both testaments. A Christian
both
Bible
testaments,
includes
yeah,
both
but they
Old and
don't
New
they
Testament.
interpret it differently.
Yeah,
That's the point.
that's right. Mom and Dad, please.
We're clearly through this whole session in the throes of the paradox or the hold two opposing thoughts at the same time about whether the Torah is universal or particular. And what I'm really, how about if that Roman military delegation had approached Hillel? What would he have told him?
Hmm.
Stand
I
on
mean,
one.
Hillel tended to have a.
I can tell you everything in the Torah by standing on one foot. What is hateful to you, do not do to another person. That's
Mhm,
all of Torah. Go do it. And
mhm,
it seems to me that that would have been a perfectly acceptable answer to the Roman military to say, you want to learn about Torah? There it is. I can tell you standing on one foot.
mhm. Though, and Hillel also, if we want a good paradigm for embracing the paradox of this particular uh, dilemma, universalistic versus particularistic concern, and I hope by the end of our class in 15 minutes, you will reframe it in your minds as it's not versus, it's universalistic and particularistic concern. That is Judaism. Hillel also said it best. If I am not for myself, who shall be for me? If I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? It's a great Zen koan, but it's also
Perfect. Perfect.
intensely Jewish. It's
Thank you.
intensely Jewish. And that's the one piece of text that I have on my wall. Nope, that's my ordination certificate. It's that one, the paper cut in the corner there. That's Hillel's teaching. If I am not for myself, who shall be for me? Particularistic. If I am for myself alone, what am I? Universalistic. And if not now, when? That's the go and do it part. Like this is not an abstraction for us. You've got to live these fully and find a way to make it all work. And unfortunately for Ed's entirely appropriate query, I don't think there's a formula. But I think we are entrusted as Jews with the moral free will to make the right choices. And we can't all do everything. Yes. And that actually leads us as the beautiful segue to our coda, because the Pirkei Avot, the chapters of our ancestors that we've studied, many of us together, and that you can go back to the YouTube and investigate, famously teaches it is not up to you to complete the work, neither are you free to desist from it. So actually, we've been talking about these kind of lateral relations, right? How we interact with our own community and with the outsider, the Gentile and the Jew. But that's all how we interact in our time here on Earth, right? Real-time interactions. We're going to kind of invert the frame now and talk about how does this play out, not so much in space or in real time, but across time. All right. And this is a very famous sugya of Talmud. So I imagine that for most of us, you've seen this before, but you've probably never contemplated it in this context. So these are the famous folk tales of Honi the Circle Drawer. Honi was kind of like a shaman of Jewish lore who is oft mentioned in the Agada and first mentioned here in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Ta'anit, which, by the way, is all about fasting. Ta'anit means a fast, but it is also about rain, because in Jewish antiquity, fast days were called first by the government and then by the rabbis as a way of propitiating God to bring the rain that would nourish the crops that would feed the people. Remember that unlike ancient Egypt, modern day Egypt, Israel did not have a reliable source of natural irrigation and cycles of fertility. It did have cycles of fertility. It has a wet season and a dry season, but Israel's produce is entirely dependent on rain, on rainfall. There's no freshwater body of like the Nile that feeds the people. So a lot of ancient prayers, all of Sukkot is this, are prayers propitiating God to bring the rain. And we encode that in the Givurot prayer, Morid Hatal, bring the dew, or Mashiv Haruach Morid Hagashem, which means bring the strong wind and rain. And we change twice a year in season, right? You ask for the dew in the spring and the summer, you ask for the heavy rains in the fall and the winter, roughly. All right, so this is a tractate about rain, and Honi the shaman, Honi the circle drawer, was a rainmaker. He would draw a circle on the ground, and he would propitiate God to bring the rains just by his magic circles, right? That's Honi. You've heard of this guy before. And we're going to look at the most famous Honi tale of them all, which is this. One day, he was walking along the road. So Yom Echad is Aramaic for Yom Echad. One day, Hava Azel be'orcha. He was walking along the road. Chaziye lehahu gavra. He came across a certain guy. Dehava nata charuva. And he was planting a carob tree. Okay, everyone know this story? This is like Sunday school story. Amarle, he said to him, and I'll switch to the English, this tree, how long is it going to take to bear fruit? After how many years will it bear fruit? And the man said to him, it will not produce fruit until 70 years have passed. Honi said to him, is it obvious to you that you will live 70 years, that you expect to benefit from this tree? That's Steinsaltz, like, you think you're going to live 70 years? The man said to Honi, that man himself found a world full of carob trees. Just as my ancestors, so that's the man talking in the third person. He said, well, I came into a world with fruit-bearing trees. Just as my ancestors planted for me, I too am planting for my descendants. And of course, here, Honi being the Rip Van Winkle of Judaism, Honi sat and ate bread. Sleep overcame him, and he slept. A cliff formed around him, and he disappeared from sight and slept for 70 years. When he awoke, he saw a certain man gathering carobs from that tree. Honi said to him, are you the one who planted this tree? He seems not aware that time has elapsed. The man said to him, I am his son's son, so I'm his grandson. Honi said to the grandson, I can learn from this that I have slept for 70 years. And indeed, he saw that his donkey had sired several herds during those many years. Honi went home and said to the members of the household, is the son of Honi Ha'agel, that's Honi the circle drawer, alive? They said to him, his son is no longer with us, but his son's son is alive. So he's kind of like taking this all in. Imagine his shock, like, oh my God, I'm so old, my son has died, but my grandson is still here. And he said to the people of his town, I'm Honi. I'm still here. I'm Rip Van Winkle. Of course, they did not believe him because it's been 70 years and we haven't seen the guy and he was hiding in a cliff schluffing. He went to the Beit Midrash, he went to the study hall where he heard the sages say about one scholar, his halachot are as enlightening and as clear as in the years of Honi HaMe'agel. So he's kind of become a figure of legend. For when Honi would enter the study hall, he would resolve for the sages any difficulty they had. So he's still being invoked in the Beit Midrash as one of the great teachers of his time. Honi said to them, I am he. I'm the guy you're quoting right now. But they did not believe him, and they did not pay him proper respect. Honi became very upset, and he's like, I can't take this anymore. He prays for God to take him for mercy, and he died. And Rava said, and this is the concluding line, which I think is absolutely amazing, comes out of nowhere. You're going to be the judge. We're going to spend the last 5 minutes with you trying to figure out what this means. I have my own thoughts. Rava said, this explains the famous folk saying that people still say, and this is one of the great lines in the Babylonian Talmud. This is a true treasure of Talmud. I'm highlighting it here in the Hebrew or the Aramaic. O chavruta o mituta. Either friendship or death. Chavruta, we know that. We're doing it now. Studying, often in dyads or, triads, small group study. But it also means friendship. It literally means being bonded to someone or something. O chavruta o mituta. Mituta is like mavet, death, in Aramaic. Either friendship, Either friendship, did I lose it? Okay, well, I'm sorry, I completely scrolled past it or forward through it, but you got it. We got to the last line. So Rava says, aha, the story of Honi, more than anything else, the moral of the story of Honi is either friendship or death. So what's going on here? And remember that the opening frame for our study today was about how far does our circle of moral obligation extend? So it's the same question I'm asking now, only the vector is not Jew and Gentile. What's the vector we're looking at in the Honi story? When we talk about our circles of moral concern, we've moved away from what's the difference between what we owe the world or our people, right? We did that today. But I flipped it for the last 15 minutes and I'm asking a different question. Or I'm asking the question the rabbis are asking here. When we talk about how far does your sphere of moral concern extend? Remember, I asked that at the very beginning, and you all answered in real time. In other words, you were thinking about what tzedakah do I give? Do I stand up as equally against Hamas as I do against violence enacted against communities of color here in the United States? Like, where's my moral obligation? But nobody did what the Honi story does. So, mom and dad, what's happening here?
He's suggesting that our moral obligation extends through time to
Right.
future generations.
Okay.
Great. Arlene, do you want to expand on this? Right, exactly. You named it.
No, I just want to support exactly what your father said, that this is a generational concept and something that indicates we all have to look beyond what's currently going on presently, because we're leaving a legacy.
Beautiful. Others comment here. I think you get it. Ed and Karen, you're muted, so you can unmute, and then Judy.
So I definitely agree, Rabbi, with your dad and with Arlene. And I was going to make a stab at the last sentence of the reading about friendship or death, because part of what resonated in that part of the Honi story was that at the end, he was all alone. He had no friends, not in his family, not in his community. And whatever goodness he had in his life, he felt without friendship, it's time to go.
And ironically, because it's in the context of Honi's name being invoked for a very noble and even holy purpose. He's being referenced as a great teacher, and he's being held up as a moral exemplar. And yet, for Honi, he is singularly fixated on the fact that he is now all alone. Judy?
If one remains alone and unto oneself, is that humanity at all? If the tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, what's going on? We have to act with each other, and certainly starting with family and then reaching out to humanity.
Right. So this really does complete the circuit that we've traveled over the last 90 minutes today, which is this. I think one of the treasures of Talmud is this core Jewish notion that there is no way to be a Jew by oneself. It's it's a radical precept. At some other day when we're not out of time, I would welcome you to challenge me on it. But I don't think you can challenge the Talmud on it. In other words, I think the Talmud is giving us a deeply Jewish notion that there is no Judaism devoid of relationship, that our tradition is not incidentally relational, but fundamentally relational, integrally relational, right? The way in which Judaism is lived is in the context of community, your own, the other, meaning the non-Jew, but they are part of what it means to be a Jew requires that you are deeply attuned to the way in which you are in relationship with the non-Jew, even when you don't want to be. Even if you decide that the best way to do that is hermetically to seal yourself off in an enclave in Monsey or in Mea Shearim, you are nevertheless in relationship, whether you choose it or not. And then, of course, this deeply Jewish notion that you are also in relationship with time or with the people who've come before you and the people who will be here after you. You may not see them. You may not know them. The talit over my shoulder that belonged to my great-grandfather Louis Kleinerman of blessed memory is a very powerful daily reminder for me. I showed you his tefillin last week or a couple weeks ago when we talked about the tefillin of God. Right? I never met the man. My dad never met the man. My dad's own father died when my dad was not yet 5 years old. And yet these people are present in my life, and I am who I am because they were who they were and how they lived, and the Judaism that they cherished is a big part of the reason that I am a Jew today. And so they were the Honis for me of yesteryear. And then we have to be the Honi for those who will come after us, right? That's why you really do have to plant the tree now, because it is not just about your temporal sphere of concern. That's the last thought I wanted to raise, and I'll welcome my dad unmuted and Judy unmuted. So you guys can face off who goes first.
It's just such a pleasure and a wonderful thing, John, to be a student of yours, to learn with this group. And your mother and I are just filled with happiness and pride at your teachings. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. The nachas you feel is the nachas you bring as well. I appreciate that. Judy?
And we are part of the family of that, of yours as we learn from you. As one gets older, one realizes within a couple of generations, you're not here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows you anymore.
Yep.
And all the pictures we have, oh, who was that? But you're there. You're there. My mom and dad and from the shtetl are there. And I am in a whole different place. My son is on television. What is television? What is the world? We'll go on, and who knows what's going to be in this world in 2 generations. It'll be a very different place.
It will.
But I'm there.
You will be.
There.
So, my friends, what a beautiful learning we've had today together, affirming together the sanctity of this precept, O chavruta o mituta, not just friendship. Friendship diminishes the full valence of chavruta. Chavruta means that you are joined. Literally, chaver means connected or joined. It's actually, you remember your little blue booklets in Hebrew school and what they were called, a machberet? A machberet is anything with a binding, right? So the pages are bound together. That's what chavruta is. You're bound. You're bound with the people who surround you in this moment. You are also bound to those who've come before and who will come after you. So, o chavruta o mituta. Without that, what are we, right? Better, we must have that, or it would be better not to exist at all. That's a good one to leave you with. I hope I'll see you or know that you're joining us live streaming for a beautiful night of friendship and gratitude and a little bit of bittersweet farewell to Isaac Son of the Sword tomorrow night. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you.